This year, I filmed and edited the biggest project of my life so far.
Everybody was like, how the hell did you guys do that?
The result is a 30-minute documentary about workers' rights in Wisconsin, and it's going to be coming out on YouTube later this year. Maybe by the time you're watching this, it has already released, but if not, stay tuned. I really want you to see it. I'm very, very proud of it. The goal of this video is just to go through how I took the mountain of raw material that I had collected. I had about 10 hours of interviews, and I turned that into the 30 minutes that ended up being the final documentary. There's gonna be a lot of information in this video. I didn't want to break it up into a bunch of smaller videos because it is all connected. I did try to do my best with the chapters for this video though, so if you're interested in one thing in particular, check the chapters because I'm gonna probably talk about that at some point. The story is primarily driven by interviews with key members of the workers' fight for a fair contract. I drove up to Wisconsin in March and filmed interviews across 3 days, ending up with about 10 hours of interviews. And this means that I needed a solid process to sift through the terabytes of interviews and keep track of what everyone is saying. To ask this much time of folks to give me their stories is a big responsibility. I needed to make sure that the final product earned all of that raw material. So let me show you the timeline of the final documentary here in DaVinci Resolve. I chose to edit in Resolve, but a lot of these techniques can be applied to any other editing program that you use. I just prefer to use Resolve. This is about a 30-minute documentary, like I said. This is actually a 28-minute and 52-second cut for a film festival that has a 29-minute limit, but this is what we're working with. And it looks kind of messy and cluttered, but I'll get into what's going on here. So we've got 10 active video tracks and 18 active audio tracks. All of these colors correspond to different things. Mostly, the different colors represent different interview subjects. So before we get too far into how we got here, let me show you what we started with. So this is what I filmed in March of 2024. These other interviews are things that I got a month or so later, but these interviews definitely make up the bulk of the raw material. I filmed with 3 cameras, my C70, R5C, and a Sony a7S III. The A and B cam were running the whole time. The C cam, I'll show you in a minute what that was about. It was not rolling the entire time. It was just there for select moments. So I really only needed to sync the A and B cam as well as the sound that I recorded with my Zoom F6. I filmed very long interviews. You can see that this one is an hour and a half long, and it's 93 gigabytes. And that's actually pretty small for a video of this size. I filmed in HEVC, and that's because I wanted to be able to fit as much as I possibly could onto one card, and I wasn't too worried about the encoding hit that I would take. And I'm really glad that this is the route I went because I had no problems with the quality in post-production. And yeah, I timed it out to the minute for how much content that I could record on my cards and just barely got everything while I was up in Wisconsin. So I put some stills into Photoshop to show you the different camera angles. This is the C70, this is the R5C, and this is an example of that C camera angle, the handheld Sony. So I pulled out this third angle when I handed the interview subjects a photo of themselves, and I kind of held up the camera to be kind of like another picture of them holding a picture of themselves. It's kind of this meta moment as I'm inserting myself into the documentary. And so that's why I had this sort of dirty set approach. You can sort of see that there's a little bit of a light into the left there. You can see a light stand off to the side. I could have very easily just cropped in and avoided seeing those elements, but I wanted to kind of draw attention to the fact that I was making a documentary in the moment. And so that's why I kept it like this. Also, I really liked how it turned out. I was lucky that the plan worked. This is the only behind the scenes material that we have to go off of, but it should give us the right idea. I brought a ton of gear and a lot of lights, but I ended up really liking a very simple lighting setup. I had my aperture 120D off to the subject's side, and that was the only light hitting the subject. This other light here, this Amaran P60C or whatever it is, it's just there to illuminate me as the interviewer, so the subject isn't just staring into complete darkness. Maybe you're getting a little bit of bounce onto the subject, but not much. I experimented with adding more lights to the scene. Like I had something rake the wall over here. I had something, do an edge light, but I ended up just really liking this very simple setup. And the background worked out really well too. This is a documentary about office workers, and so we're in an office, and it is really lucky that it worked out to look like this because this was kind of our only angle. You can kind of tell we weren't in maybe the coolest location. There's kind of like stuff coming in on the ceiling here and all that. And since this was a one person operation, I didn't have the headspace to think about setting up an alternate angle or a second location or anything like that. I just wanted something that I knew looked good and I didn't have to worry about because I had so many other things going on. You can tell I'm monitoring audio, I've got the two camera angles set up, I've got my notes there. It really was everything happening all at once, and I'm really lucky everything ended up working out all right. There's that third camera that I pick up at some point during the interview when I slide this folder across the table to them and they open it up and they see a photo of themselves. Something I want to call out is that I did change up the lighting very slightly on the second and third day of recording interviews. You can tell that Liz's face is a little bit less contrasty than Joe's. Here you can see a pretty strong shadow on this side of Joe's face, and it's a little bit lighter in this photo. And that's because I ended up just rotating this light a little bit more so it filled in the shadow side of the face. It worked really well for Joe's interview, especially, and the other interviews we got on that first day. Just the way that the sun was coming in, it ended up looking really nice. But I noticed on the second and third days, it was just a little bit too dark overall, so I introduced that other light. Another cool thing that happened during Joe's interview is that the sun was going down. It was March in Wisconsin, so we didn't get a ton of daylight, and it ended up having this really cool blue effect in the background that I just wasn't planning for, but it was a really cool look. It's kind of a natural orange teal look that ended up looking really neat. So here we are back in Resolve. I used DaVinci Resolve Studio 18, even though 19 came out while I was editing. It was in beta. There were some features that I was really curious about, but I made the mature decision and stuck with the stable release. So here are all of the interviews that we got over those 3 days, back to back to back to back. We've got about 10 hours here on the timeline. This timeline is just where I dropped the two camera angles and the sound and synced them up, and then trimmed off the beginnings and endings of all the clips so they just started and ended at the same points. So this might make me a sicko. You might disagree with me, but I don't like editing with multicam. I don't know, something about it. It's just not for me. I like having stacked clips and I just disable the top clip when I want to see the one underneath it. It works well for me. I want to touch on color really quick. While I'm putting together initial assembly cuts, I don't want to be looking at just flat log footage. And so I brought everything into the color page and used groups to turn everything into a Rec 709 looking image. So I've got 13 different interviews, 2 angles for each one. So I've got a group for Joe on the R5C and a group for Joe on the C70. And I've just got a color transform on the R5C that's going from Canon Log 3, and I've got a color transform on the C70 that's going from Canon Log 2. Worked out nice. I didn't use color management because I just like to have a little bit more control over what everything is going into and out of. So that's what's going on with that. And then from this point, I can move into actually getting into the content of things. And so the way that I like to do this is by going through transcripts of all of the interviews. And I know DaVinci Resolve has this transcription feature now, but it doesn't have the ability to export time codes with the transcriptions, which is very strange. And that's something that I need for my workflow to work. So I ended up having to send all of this material over to Adobe Premiere and using their auto transcription tool. And this is how I did that. You can just go to File, Export Timeline, and through experimentation, you select Final Cut Pro 7 XML v5. And then you can save that XML file. And then in Premiere, you can import that. And you've got everything in a sequence, which is really, really cool. At this point, I built out individual timelines for each interviewee. and then had Premiere just auto-transcribe everything. Then you can export the transcript as a text file. Then I turn that text file into a PDF, and I've got a full transcription of the interview with time codes, which is excellent. So at this point, I can take a break from the computer, I take my iPad, and I just go through the transcripts and highlight pieces that I think are compelling sound bites. I go through and I say, oh, I like this. She says that's what happens when unions fight and when they win. That's a good sound bite. I'm not really thinking too hard about it. I've already heard the conversation once, but I'm just picking out things. Hey, does this sound cool? I do that for every interview, and then I'm ready to head back to the computer and start pulling selects. So I'll stick with Adrian's interview as an example. I go through the transcript and I see, okay, she has this sound bite at about a little bit past 4 minutes, 25 seconds. I'll go to 4 minutes, 25 seconds. I'll hit play.
Is these days.
Yeah, I think it's certainly heightened. I mean, that's what happens when unions fight and when they win.
There you go. She ended up saying something cool past that point, so I included that in the select as well.
I mean, but the fight is most important because they become then part of the public consciousness, right? And public awareness.
And so don't be too beholden to the punctuation and the auto transcription. Be flexible. Move on to the next soundbite. It's a little bit past 5:31.
It matters that the media covers it. I think that non-traditional media has been really key in helping to build that understanding and awareness of what's happening.
And there you go. So this process, as you might imagine, does take a long time, but it's kind of good to have this tedious task in front of you that you can just kind of chip away at. And while you're doing that, you familiarize yourself more deeply with the material. It's okay. It means that you don't have to attack the whole thing all at once. You don't have to turn the editor brain on quite yet. You just kind of let it warm up. So I'm just marking selects by moving those excerpts to a track higher. And that's so I can, at the end of it all, select everything and paste that into its own timeline. And so this is where you do start engaging that editor brain that I just mentioned, and you start categorizing things. What is she talking about here in this select? What's she talking about there? Can these clips be put together into a group that's about the context for what's happening in US labor outside of Wisconsin, for example? And then once you do that for all of your interviews, you've got a bunch of different categories. And then when you're putting things together, you know, you can always dip into one of these timelines for clips about office and tech workers in particular, for example. I've got a timeline that's just bangers, and that's for clips that are really, really good dramatically or emotionally or something that aren't necessarily about a particular subject. They're just things that I can picture being a mic drop moment in a documentary. So once I've got everything categorized, I can start piecing things together just by putting things next to each other and see how it's feeling, see how it's flowing. This is a little bit of a draw the rest of the owl, but hopefully all this preparation has led you to the point where you're pretty familiar with the material and you start to get a sense for how things might flow into one another. Just start slapping things together, and it doesn't need to be right at the beginning. You can just work on the middle for a little bit and then figure out the beginning later. Follow your nose. When you make big iterations, I would recommend duplicating your timeline, and that way you can always go back if your decision didn't really work out. You know, eventually you'll hopefully end up with something that you really, really like. So this is where I'm going to stop this video. I'm planning a follow-up that's going to get into more of what's going on with like all of these audio tracks, because there's a whole bunch of them and there's some cool things going on with the intro specifically. That's a cool soundscape that my brother helped me with. I want to talk about the color for it all. If there are any questions that you have about how this workflow works, if I missed anything, please let me know and I can address them in that follow-up. Well, I hope this was helpful. I'm really glad that I recorded this, if only just to remind myself how to do all of this and kind of marvel at, wow, this was a lot of work. So I hope this is helpful for you. Thank you for watching.
We're less than 2 weeks away from a planned strike.
They've been without a contract now since March of last year.
A brighter financial future. Oh, really?
When you think about workers who are organizing, particularly in the 21st century, the first people that come to your mind are not white-collar insurance financial service workers.
Everybody was like, how the hell did you guys do that? But it was all just like us just being crazy enough to think, yeah, we have the right to do this.
These people are not lazy. Not by a long shot.
If you're working for a living, you're working class.
Think about the way corporate America is going.
Madison has the same kind of malaise as every place else. People just feel like there's nothing they can do and no one's gonna fight. And so now you get these like nerdy office workers going on a strike of hundreds of people. I think something broke open here. There's possibility.